Today on CityCast Nashville, Tennessee's Education Freedom Scholarship Act, aka the School Voucher Program, is up and running statewide this fall. With news that State House Speaker Cameron Sexton already wants to double the program's size in 2026, we've got some questions. Like, is it working? What do we know about the families who enrolled? And how are we tracking success? Melissa Brown, Tennessee Bureau Chief for the nonprofit education news outlet Chalkbeat, joins me to explain. It's Monday, October 20th. I'm your executive producer, Whitney Pasterek, and this is what Nashville's talking about. During a special session last January, the Republican-led Tennessee General Assembly signed the Education Freedom Scholarship Act into law. These scholarships, also known as vouchers, provide a little over $7,000 of state funding to help families pay to send their kids to private school. Melissa, you've really been crushing your reporting about this over at Chalkbeat. How's the rollout going?
It's going. The voucher program is up and running. Vouchers, I think, flowed out to families over the last couple of months. I think the question is if vouchers are working, and I think that really depends on what your definition of working is. The overarching message about this program was that Governor Lee and other backers wanted to expand school choice in Tennessee, which means expanding the ability for parents to pick and choose where their child goes to school. It's a little hard to evaluate that goal right now with what data we have available from the state. I think, of course, families who have received this money would probably say it is working. It's alleviating something in their budget. But yeah, I think it kind of depends on who you're talking to and where their opinion lies on whether or not the program is working and working as intended right now.
Well, let's back up and just remember how we got here. Nashville already had a private school choice program called Education Savings Accounts, which continues to offer scholarships of about $9,800 to families that financially qualify in Davidson, Shelby, and Hamilton counties, correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's kind of been like this long, steady march toward this larger, universal statewide voucher program. And yes, that kind of initial program, which was very controversial, could do a whole episode about all the kind of political craziness surrounding that. I mean, actually, this is kind of forgotten about a lot, but before that, there was a kind of the first voucher program in Tennessee, and that was specifically for kids with disabilities. It was called the IEA program. And so that was sort of the first foray for the state into kind of using public taxpayer dollars to go to private schools.
So were any changes made between our existing program and the one that launched statewide this year?
It's a very different program. Sort of like the nuts and bolts of it was very similar. But I think just the size of it and how they sort of differentiated between certain pots of income limited and no income cap.
Okay, well, let's talk numbers. How many kids in Tennessee are now using vouchers, and how much is this costing taxpayers?
So this first year program, there were 20,000 seats. From what we know now, all 20,000 of those seats or vouchers or scholarships, depending on who you're talking to, have been taken. So that's 20,000 kids enrolled in private schools who are using these kind of state public dollars to either totally pay or pay in part their private school tuition. The money question, it's a little complicated. The budget line this year is $144 million. So that's like just the specific budget line for basically the scholarship money, the voucher money itself. There's a little money elsewhere, for example, to pay for like new staff at the department. There was nearly $200 million included in this special session as one-time bonuses for public school teachers as a sort of pot sweetener to help get this program over the line. And so that's not technically a voucher program cost, but when you're thinking about it, that's kind of something that has been included. So that $144 million is this first year. We do expect the program to grow. And I think last January, kind of the General Assembly's own fiscal analyst estimated that it will probably cost the state around $1.1 billion over the next 5 years. That was an estimate made kind of projecting what they thought the program would grow into. And it's possible that it's going to grow beyond that, when we come back into session next year.
Well, yeah, you recently reported that Speaker Cameron Sexton wants to double the program for next year due to what his office is calling overwhelming demand. Meanwhile, Nashville Democratic State House Rep. John Ray Clements says, quote, the voucher program is one of the most expensive and unpopular Republican welfare programs in recent history. Our state cannot afford the current voucher scam, much less doubling the size of it. Melissa, what's the truth here? Can we afford to expand? And where will all that extra money come from?
It's a hard question to answer in black and white. I believe the term was at least double the program. So that's at least 20,000 more seats next year. I do think there is a little concern about expanding so quickly, and particularly in the context of our budget conversations next year. You know, I know the Tennessean reported that sort of the budget chief in Tennessee, kind of over finance administration, said that next year's budget might be a little tighter than it has been in recent years. We've seen kind of falling revenue, and, you know, Tennessee had this great period of financial growth, and that has really just scaled back in addition to larger kind of macroeconomic issues going on right now. And so it's really hard to know what it will look like in a few months when the governor presents his budget. Lawmakers always push back a little bit on things that they want to fund and where the money is for that. So I think Speaker Sexton's goal is quite ambitious. I think some other, even Republicans who support the voucher program, are being a little more cautious about saying they want to expand that much further. Something that's really interesting and important to keep in mind is at the special session, when they passed this original bill that established this program, they baked in an expansion cap of 5,000 seats. And a lot of times within debates, that was really pointed to as saying, like, we can do this program and be fiscally responsible and not expand too much too fast. Because I think if you look at the program in Arizona, there's a lot of reporting that it really kind of blew up the state budget because there was so much demand, and the program kind of exploded. And so a lot of Tennessee lawmakers were like, well, we're going to do this in a responsible way. We can only expand by 5,000 seats a year. But lawmakers change laws every year, and it seems like there is some appetite to kind of blow up that 5,000 seat cap. That's going to be a huge point of debate when lawmakers come back in January.
Well, it's interesting to think about the Republican opposition that has existed since the voucher conversation really started in Tennessee. It's part of why it was so controversial to bring them to Nashville and Shelby County. It's that not all Republicans are on board with this. And, you know, we've just had a primary election where we saw State House Rep. Jody Barrett facing millions of dollars of out-of-state funding for attack ads because he had voted no. Are Republicans feeling like it's too much of a risk to speak out against this?
That's an interesting question, and something I, as a previous state political reporter, now an education reporter, it's something so fascinating about the voucher issue and school choice is that it's not a black and white, like Republican versus Democratic issue. A lot of time it comes down to where you're located as a lawmaker, and we see a lot of rural lawmakers feel quite differently about the voucher conversation. And I think when you saw, because there were a couple of, or more than a couple of Republicans who crossed the aisle to vote against the voucher program when it passed, earlier this year.
Why are rural Republicans more likely to be against this?
I think there are several issues at play, but really, if you just kind of think about the practicality of a small town, it has a single high school. I'm from a tiny town in Alabama. It's a single school system. There's not enough kids to basically support a competing private school, a competing high school. And then you think about a small town, like the high school, the middle school, they're often like the heartbeat of a community. They employ so many people. Everyone's like Friday night social plans are at the high school football games. And so I think there's more kind of a cohesive community around public schools in some ways in small towns. And it can't be like overstated. There's the lack of availability of private schools. It doesn't necessarily make sense to support a program when you know that your constituents don't have anywhere else to send their kids, and in many ways are happy with the school that is available to them. there are more private schools in urban areas. So Davidson County, Shelby County, Knox, the Chattanooga area are all seeing more private schools that are receiving these vouchers. And then you also see a couple of ring counties in the Davidson County area, like Williamson, that has a high number of private schools that are receiving students who are in the voucher program.
If my child was already attending one of those private schools, could I have gotten a voucher just to help defray the costs of where my kid was already going?
100% you could get a voucher even if your child had been going to a private school for 5-7 years. We think that's happening a lot. You see other state voucher programs that are very similar. In the first year, the vast majority of people who take advantage of the program are families who have already been enrolled in private schools.
All right, we're going to take a quick break, but before we do, one quick question. If we're going to double the size of the voucher program, will we also be doubling the size of the one-time bonus Sweeten the Pot for public school teachers program?
That's a great question. I would venture to say probably no. And I don't think that pot sweetener will be included next year, but I'm sure a lot of teachers would love to ask that question as well.
Every day, United Way of Greater Nashville brings our community together so every child, individual, and family in Middle Tennessee can thrive. Right now, 1.2 million Tennessee households are working hard but still struggling to make ends meet. Nearly half of Davidson County families and a third in Williamson County live below the ALICE threshold. That's asset limited, income constrained, and employed. But did you know that last year alone, United Way partners helped meet nearly 500,000 basic needs across Middle Tennessee? That means thousands of Davidson County students started school with supplies this fall. And kids in Williamson County get free books each month, all thanks to the United Way and its supporters. Your workplace can be a part of supporting the United Way's vital work today, because when employees give together, morale grows, businesses thrive, and Greater Nashville becomes stronger. Learn how your workplace can help at unitedwaygreaternashville.org/workplace-campaigns. Together, we're lifting up Middle Tennessee, meeting needs today and building stronger communities for tomorrow.
Melissa, how do parents sign up for a voucher? What's that process like?
I think applications opened in May of this year, and you basically have to prove state residency. And eventually, if you receive the voucher, you have to prove that you have a seat in a private school. But other than that, there's not a ton of kind of documentation required. This year, there were the income cap. There were 20,000 vouchers, 10,000 were income capped. And so parents had to provide some financial documentation if they were going for that portion. But that was just for half of the vouchers.
So the income cap for the original vouchers here was $81,120 for a family of 4, which the Tennessean reports is just over the median household income for families with children. What's the statewide income cap? And is it designed to ensure lower income families have access to this money?
Yes, if lower income is a relative term, it's in the law, it's kind of legalese, it's a certain percentage of like a federal income level. If you do the math, it comes out to around $173,000 for a family of 4, which is quite like well above average in Tennessee. So it's not really, I think originally some reporting called it like a low income category. It's really not low income if you think about kind of the swath of income ranges in Tennessee, but it makes more sense to call it income capped.
So let me get this straight. Half the vouchers are going to people whose families of 4 make less than $173,000 a year. The other half are going to people whose families make more than that?
Right. I can't say for sure. I mean, there's definitely feasibly, like you could make less than 173,000 and have applied to that kind of more universal category. But yes, that the income capped is well above the average family income in Tennessee. And then the other 10,000, it was just like open season, anyone can apply. That's also an interesting part of this issue is I do think, while maybe not said explicitly in the run-up to passing this program, the suggestion often was that we needed this program in Tennessee to serve families without means to pay for private school or to help them make choices about their children's education. And if you're looking at average household income in Tennessee, this program does not really carve out a specific advantage for low-income families.
And you mentioned earlier that, in fact, the first voucher program in Tennessee was intentionally for kids with disabilities. How are kids with disabilities faring under the current system now?
Yeah, that's something I have a particular kind of like professional interest in. And these are often underserved, vulnerable populations. The problem is we don't know how many kids with disabilities are benefiting from this program. And looking at other voucher programs across the nation, it is, I don't know if I want to say unusual, but it is a choice by Tennessee to not intentionally track how many kids with disabilities are benefiting from this program. That's a concern for education advocates, for disability advocates, for a couple of different reasons. The main one is that families are foregoing some very significant federal rights when they move to a private school. And that is, of course, a parent's choice. And the state does inform parents. I think I've seen it on the kind of voucher application. There's a line of like, I'm completely paraphrasing here. It was like, by the way, you are giving up some of these federal disability rights by moving to a private school. And that's not to say that that's not working for some families. I have talked to a Nashville mom who is thrilled to have gotten this money. It enabled her daughter, who has different learning needs, to move to a school that better serves her. She felt very kind of unseen and underserved in a public school. Providing special education for students with differing learning needs is really hard to do. It's expensive, and public schools do not always get it right. But I think the issue is that it's going to be very hard to know what broad outcomes are. Lawmakers who support the program say not every child is best served by a public school, and educational choice leads to better education outcomes. But without robust data, without knowing who is being served, how do we know that? How do we measure that? And I think particularly for students with disabilities who are giving up some accountability protections, I think that's a big concern that will trail the program for a while.
So we're not tracking where these students were previously enrolled in schools. We're not tracking kids with disabilities who may or may not be taking advantage of this program. I want to talk about another sort of data-driven part of schooling that is also under fire right now in Tennessee. You published a story at the end of last month in which some educators are pushing back on all the standardized testing required by the state for our public schools. Here in Nashville, students using the original voucher program who are in third grade or above are required to take the state's TCAP test every year. And the Tennessean just reported that education savings account student participants, on average, continue to test well behind their public school peers, according to new data released this month by the Tennessee Department of Education. Are kids using the new statewide vouchers also required to take the TCAP test?
No, not necessarily. And that was, I think, a huge part of some private school lobbying while this program was being considered, is that they did not want to take public funds if it was going to require them to do certain things. That's sort of the point of a private school, or it has long been a point of a private school, that you don't have public funds, and so you're not accountable to certain public accountability measures. Private schools, to legally operate in Tennessee, private schools must administer a nationally standardized achievement test to operate. That's sort of like the minimum requirement. The issue with that is that that's not one specific test. They can pick kind of what test that would be. And when you're trying to evaluate students, I mean, like anyone knows, you're gathering statistics or data. If it's not controlled, if everyone's not taking the same test, it's very hard to measure like one school against another, or this set of students against this set of students. Now, private schools can choose, if they want to administer these state tests that public schools administer. If they decide this is the standardized achievement test that we want to give our students, they can do that. But if they do that, if they choose to participate in like the TCAP testing the state does, then they have to submit student assessment data to a certain office within the Tennessee Department of Education. So that's a long-winded way of saying that private school students are tested in some ways, and the state will collect some data, but it is not on the level of public schools, and it will be just almost impossible to accurately kind of compare outcomes. And I think the really fascinating part of this is looking sort of the long lens of Tennessee education. You simultaneously have this push for vouchers, for school choice, for allowing parents to move their kids to schools that do not have these robust testing and accountability mechanisms. At the same time, Tennessee, among several other southern states, have been actual leaders in educational pushes for sort of more robust expectations. They think about like the third grade reading law, which was extremely controversial, but there is some evidence out there that sort of these early interventions led by testing to determine like, are our third graders capable of reading at the level we want them to be? And if they're not, we need to provide some very serious interventions. All of that is tied to testing. And Tennessee and other southern states have seen some like good outcomes in that way. But at the same time, the state is almost providing a mechanism for students to test less and to have less accountability and understanding of how they're doing. So it sort of leaves like dueling and almost contradictory goals that Tennessee's educational path has taken in the last couple of years. And I think that's really interesting.
Given the lack of data and the lack of any sort of fixed metric, how can we ultimately measure the success of students and the success of the voucher program as it continues on and potentially expands? Like, what will show us that this is working and this is the right thing for our kids?
That's a really hard question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to it.
Cool.
I will say, I think like lawmakers who support this program just heavily focus on parental choice and parental satisfaction. And they say, if you have the choice, the parent will know best if it's working well for the child, and they can choose to disenroll, enroll elsewhere. I do think, education advocates very much disagree and say that that is not appropriate or enough data or understanding of how well our students are being served. So I think it will continue to be kind of a fight over that issue.
And then ultimately, I guess the question comes down to, how are these vouchers and the taxpayer dollars needed to subsidize them impacting our kids and teachers in public schools or our public school system in general?
One of the major overarching questions and disagreements around this program is what it could down the road do to public schools. It's also one that is difficult to see in the short term. I think the main fear is large-scale kind of disenrollment, which could lead to some public schools losing some state dollars. But that is sort of a trend line we'd have to follow because, it's only been a couple of months, one school year. But I do think you can look to other states and see that that has been an issue for some states in terms of disenrollment in public schools. And the argument was made when the program was being debated of like, this is a small number of kids, and that is true. The 20,000 students is, just a percentage of the children who are still being served by the public school system. But I think over time, if we do see it double this year, what might it expand the third year? And so I think for opponents of the voucher program, I think they're concerned about like the slippery slope that is opened up by using taxpayer dollars to fund both the private and the public school system and what the long-term effects could be. And unfortunately, it's just one of those things that will maybe have to be a couple of years out before we can understand the true scope of how it affected the public schools.
Well, I know this is something that you will continue to report on at Chalkbeat, and we are so grateful for your reporting. And folks at home, if your kid is currently receiving an education scholarship in order to attend a private school and you're loving the experience, we want to hear from you. Feel free to email us anytime at nashville@citycast.fm. If we don't have any official metrics of this, like Melissa said, the best thing we can do is just talk to parents and kids. So we want to hear from y'all at home. Drop us a line. Melissa, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us, and we hope to have you back sometime.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'd love to come back.
That's all for today here on CityCast Nashville. And don't forget, you can support this show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Nashville neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And if you enjoyed the show, why not tell your friends? Rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Nashville newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Y'all take care of each other.